Hello class, welcome back to this lecture. We're going to continue on now by exploring a little bit about the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is responsible for many of the most sophisticated human cognitive abilities that we have. Things such as perception, memory, attention, thought, language, and consciousness are all made up within the cortex. The cortex is divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right hemispheres, which are connected by a bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. Now, each hemisphere is further divided into four lobes. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is located in the front of the brain and is responsible for many important cognitive functions, such as decision-making, problem-solving, and planning. It is also involved in the control of voluntary movements, such as those required for walking and speaking and writing. The parietal lobe, located behind the frontal lobe, is responsible for processing information related to touch and pressure and temperature and pain. It also plays a role in spatial awareness and the processing of sensory information from the environment. The temporal lobe, located at the side of the brain, is involved in the processing of auditory information, such as language, as well as music, as well as in memory and emotional responses. And finally, the occipital lobe, located at the back of the brain, is responsible for processing visual information from the eyes. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of the cerebral cortex is its ability to change and adapt in response to experience and learning. And this ability, known as neuroplasticity, allows the brain to reorganize and rewire itself to a limited extent in response to new experiences and challenges. For example, musicians who practice regularly can develop larger and more specialized areas of the brain devoted to processing musical information. So, despite the many advances that we made in understanding the cerebral cortex, there's still much that we don't know. For example, we're still trying to understand the neural basis of consciousness fully, and how different regions of the cortex work together to create our subjective experience of the world. Now, we know that consciousness resides within the cortex, because when you damage parts of the cortex, then types of conscious awareness disappear with an individual, but beyond that, it's very difficult to understand. But research is ongoing, and we're always shedding new light on these fascinating questions. And we can be confident that we'll continue to make exciting discoveries about the brain and the mind in the years to come. But for now, just be aware that the cortex is that outer layer of the brain that makes conscious existence possible. The cerebral cortex, literally, cortex means bark-like structure, is that textured outer layer of the brain that gives us the ability to do all the things that make us who we are. And the cerebral cortex is responsible for many of the most sophisticated human cognitive abilities, such as perception, memory, attention, thought, language, and consciousness. So be mindful of all of that. So let's just take a little bit of a view into this. And one thing that I like to do with my students is to have them remember the cortex by doing FPOT. So just put your hand on your forehead and go F, just like you're cursing, F. And then pot. And as you do pot, you hit the top of your head, hit the back of your head, and slap the side of your head. Not hard, obviously, but F, you slap your forehead, pot, and then slap the top of your head, the back of your head, and the side of your head. And that reminds you of where the different lobes are located. F for your frontal lobe, P for your parietal lobe on top of your head, occipital lobe in the back of your head, and temporal lobe, T, on the side of your head. So let's just go and take a little bit more time now and look at each of these lobes, because they're really quite fascinating. And a wonderful thing to be aware of is, particularly when you're dealing with someone that has traumatic brain injury, to know where the various areas of the brain are and what's injured. You can have a better sense of what is being disrupted in that person's functioning. So, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe of the brain is one of the most complex regions of the cerebral cortex, and it plays a critical role in a wide range of cognitive functions. The frontal lobe is located, obviously, in the front part of the brain, and is the largest lobe of the cerebral cortex. And so I want to look at, what does the frontal lobe do? Well, one of the primary functions of the frontal lobe is executive function. And executive function involves the ability to plan, to organize, to initiate, to consider consequences, to make moral judgments, and to execute complex behaviors, as well as the ability to monitor and adjust one's behaviors based upon feedback. In other words, the frontal lobe helps us make decisions and carry out plans. And this is why damage to the frontal lobe can cause a resulting deficit in executive function, such as difficulty in making decisions and difficulty in controlling impulses. Another important function of the frontal lobe is attention. The frontal lobe helps us to focus our attention and maintain it over time. The prefrontal cortex, which is the frontmost region of the frontal lobe, is particularly important in sustained attention, and damage to this can result in attentional deficits. The frontal lobe is also involved in working memory, which is the ability to hold information in mind for brief periods of time in order to perform mental tasks. And the prefrontal cortex in particular is important for working memory, and damage to this area can result in deficits in working memory. Now, in addition to executive function, attention, and working memory, the frontal lobe is also involved in a number of other cognitive functions. For example, the frontal lobe plays a role in language processing and social behavior and emotional regulation. The frontal cortex is particularly important in social cognition, which includes the ability to perceive and interpret the emotions of others, as well as to understand and respond appropriately to social cues. So overall, I hope you see that the frontal lobe plays a critical role in a wide range of cognitive functions, and so damage to this area can result in deficits in executive function, which is the primary role, or perhaps even in areas of attention or working memory or social cognition. And so it's really important for us to be mindful of the roles that the frontal lobe plays in order to understand the brain and how it functions. Next, we have the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is located in the top and back of the brain, and so in the very top of the brain, essentially, and is responsible for processing sensory information from the body. And this includes things like touch and temperature and pain. And it helps us understand our spatial relationship with the world around us and is involved in spatial awareness, in perception, and integration of sensory information. So the parietal lobe also plays a crucial role in numerical and mathematical processes and helps us understand and to manipulate numbers. And it's also involved in attention and working memory, allowing us to focus our attention and keep important information in our mind while we're doing a task. So overall, the parietal lobe is essential for our ability to perceive with and to interact with the world around us. And so that's very important, obviously. And then the occipital lobe. And here's the funny thing about human beings. We actually see with the back of our heads. We sense, yes, with our eyes, but we actually see and process that information in the back of our head, in our occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, located in the back of the brain, is responsible for processing visual information. It contains several specialized areas that process different aspects of vision, including color and shape and motion. So the primary visual cortex located in the occipital lobe receives information from the eyes and processes it into meaningful visual perceptions. And the occipital lobe is also involved in higher level visual processing, such as things like object recognition and visual memory. So overall, the occipital lobe plays a critical role in allowing us to perceive and make sense of the world around us through our sense of sight. And you can just see how important sight is because it has this whole area of our brain dedicated to its processing. And then we have our temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is the region of the brain responsible primarily for processing auditory information, particularly in the left side of our brain. And this includes the perception of sound as well as for visual perception and memory formation. There's a lot of association zones that tie in with the temporal lobe. The primary auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, which allows us to recognize sounds and to understand speech. The temporal lobe also plays a crucial role in memory formation and retrieval, including the creation and storage of long-term memories. So additionally, it is involved in processing visual information, especially the recognition of faces and objects. And so damage to the temporal lobe can result in language and memory impairments, as well as difficulties in recognizing faces and objects. And there I hope you see that the connection between the temporal and the occipital lobe, there's some close connection that happens there. So those are our four lobes, our FPOD. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now, I want you to just look on that little image on the slide, because you see below there, on that image, you see a little cauliflower structure beneath the occipital lobe. That is something known as the cerebellum, which literally means the little brain. And it is kind of like a second brain for you. The cerebellum, located at the base of the brain, is primarily responsible for controlling movement and balance. It receives information from the sensory system, the spinal cord, and other parts of the brain to coordinate and refine movements. So, if you have a skill like tying your shoe or simply sitting down without thinking about it, that is all thanks to the cerebellum. It plays a critical role in skilled development like writing, like playing an instrument in sports. You don't have to consciously think about it because your cerebellum is doing all the work there. The cerebellum also helps to regulate cognitive functions such as attention and language emotion. So damage to the cerebellum can result in movement and balance disorders as well as cognitive impairment. So, for example, you would have to consciously think about all the movements you would have to do to walk or to tie your shoe, which, as I'm sure you can recognize, it would be very difficult. And so the cerebellum itself plays a very fascinating role within a person. So overall, we have three main themes that I wanted to kind of highlight today. First off, just recognizing that we are, and our existence is based upon our biology. And so it all ties together. Then there are neurons. And neurons are the cells of the nervous system that function to transmit and receive information. There are neurotransmitters, and those are the chemicals that relay signals across the synapses between the neurons. And there's the cortex, that outer bark-like structure of the brain that is made up of organized neurons that form the basis of conscious thought and action. So in conclusion, I hope you see that the brain is a complex and obviously essential organ that is responsible for controlling and coordinating all bodily functions. It is made up of billions of neurons that communicate with each other using electricity and chemical signals via neurotransmitters. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain, and it is responsible for higher level functions such as consciousness, perception, and thought. The cortex is divided into 4 main regions, each with a distinct function. The frontal lobe, responsible for decision-making, planning, and problem-solving. The parietal lobe, responsible for processing sensory information such as touch, temperature, and pressure. The occipital lobe, responsible for processing visual information. And the temporal lobe, responsible for processing auditory information and memory. Additionally, the cerebellum plays a critical role in motor control, coordination, and balance. Understanding the function of the brain and the different regions and structures really is essential in comprehending how we think, how we feel, and interact with the world around us, and for understanding how others think, feel, and interact with the world around them. And that concludes our lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in our next module. You take care. Goodbye.